And the title for today's message is Israel's History in Signs. Actually, it should be Israel's History and Future in Signs, because it not only goes to Israel's history, but also to her future. And so that's the title for today, Israel's History and Future in Signs. So let's start off by reading through the text. Let's read verses 1 through 6. Israel's history and future in signs. And we start off in verses 1 through 2 with the sign of the pregnant woman. So we have a pregnant woman in heaven, and that's a sign for us. And so let's go ahead and go back to verses 1 through 2. Looking at verse 1, it says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven." Usually when we're going through, biblical passages, even prophecy, we always want to look at the literal truth if possible. That's the thing of Calvary Chapel. We look at the literal truth, except where it's clear in the text that it's not meant to be literal. It's meant to be a sign. And so here it's very, very clear. You can't mistake it that what's following this is intended to be a sign. And so we should not assume that these things are literal. Now, all symbolism, all figurative language has a literal correspondence, but the picture itself is figurative. So you have to say, okay, what's the picture? And then what reality does it picture in that symbol? And so we have to look first at the symbol and then see what the literal reality is. Okay, so let's look at the symbol. What's the first sign here? You've got a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Now, just off the bat, I'll say what it is not. It is not Mary. That's what the Catholic Church often says about this passage. They say, oh, that's Mary. Well, why would you assume first that it's Mary? It's this cosmic woman in the heavens, so she's not on earth. I don't, it's like, maybe that's the picture that they have of Mary, some celestial being or something like that. But it's a picture of a woman in the heavens, and she's clothed with the sun, so it's like she's radiating brightness, right? And what else does she have? She's got the moon under her feet, and on her head she's got a garland of 12 stars. Now, have you ever seen a passage in the Bible that has a picture similar to this? Anybody remember something? There's a picture similar to this in the Bible? Bible college students? No, I got some former Bible college students here. What's that? There's a particular Old Testament patriarch who had some dreams. Do you remember the dreamer? Joseph the dreamer. Remember one of his dreams? He had a dream with the sun and moon and 12 stars, and they were all bowing down to him. And his brothers and his father, they all knew what that was speaking of. They said, what, are we going to bow down and, bow down to you? Well, he ended up doing that because, they went to Egypt and all that story. Anyways, but basically that was a picture of Israel. You've got the sun, the moon, the 12 stars. You've got this picture of Israel, with the 12 stars being the 12 tribes, Isaac, and then, of course, Rebekah. So Jacob was the, son. And so that represents Israel as a whole. So this is most likely a picture of Israel. It's not a picture of Mary, it's a picture of Israel. That's why in the title, it's Israel's History and Future in Signs. So she's clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and her head, the garland of 12 stars. That really represents her whole history right there. Where did she come from? Isaac and Rebekah. And what was her legacy? The 12 stars, which is the 12 tribes of Israel that carried down throughout all their history. So that's really the entire history of Israel right there in that picture. The sun, the moon, and the 12 stars. Now, what's her condition right now in this picture? She's pregnant. Look at verse 2. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And for those ladies who have had babies, you know about this, and I've seen it happen 5 times. Of course, there's no way I could fully understand it, but I've seen it happen, so I could, looks very painful. I don't know, I don't ever want to feel it because it looks very scary, but I'm sure it's very, very painful seeing my wife give birth 5 times. And when it's the final part, right before you're about to have the baby, that's when the lady starts to cry out. And that's a nice way to put it, because it's just, from my perspective, so super painful. The first stage of labor, it's fun. Oh, we're having the baby. Second stage, just don't talk to me right now. Just don't talk to me. And third stage is just like, because it's so painful at that point. So someday, you men, if you have kids, you get married, you'll understand that. If you have kids or ladies, you know about that as well. And so if it's coming to the point where she's crying out in pain, that means it's time. That's the baby's about to be born. Now, what is this speaking of? Okay, so we've got the first aspect of the symbol. That's Israel, right? She's giving birth to a child. Is the child figurative or a literal child? Remember, the woman is a figurative woman. It's not a woman, it's Israel. She's giving birth to a child. Is it a literal child or is it a figurative child? I would tend to think that the figurative language continues throughout this whole picture. Oftentimes, it's initially assumed with this passage that that's speaking of Jesus, that Israel gives birth to Jesus. Well, that would actually make more sense if it was speaking about Mary, because she's a literal woman and Jesus is a literal person. But could it be that it's a figurative woman representing Israel, and the child is figurative also of something else? It's possible. So as we go through the text, we'll look through and see what this could quite possibly be talking about. So first of all, we see the sign of the pregnant woman, which is Israel in her history, giving birth, about to give birth to someone, something. Let's hold that in our heads and come back to that in a little bit as we get to verse 5. Okay, let's look at verses 3 through 4. This is a second sign. This is the sign of the great red dragon. In verse 3 it says, "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great, fiery, red dragon." Okay, so we've got another sign. And the text, again, is very clear. This is a sign. It's not a literal dragon. I don't know if these creatures ever existed, but in mythology at least, which it could be that there were actually dinosaurs before that had wings that were considered like dragons. It's possible. And I don't know, breathing fire. There's a whole bunch of mythologies around them. This one isn't necessarily breathing fire or whatnot, but it's this huge beast, like a dinosaur, that's standing before this cosmic woman. So she's in heaven. She's in the, outside of the planet. And this dragon is also outside of the planet, and he's waiting for her to give birth there outside of the as we'll see in verse 4, outside of the the earth. They're not on the earth. So what could this dragon possibly be speaking of as well? What do you guys think? What's the dragon speaking of? Okay, so later on in the passage, it does say Satan is a dragon, but also we have to look to the picture of Revelation chapter 17, because the symbolism here fits with the fuller picture of chapter 17. In chapter 17, you're given the same picture of the 7 heads, the 10 horns, the 7 diadems on those heads, and that is a picture not just of Satan, but at the world order that Satan runs. So it's Satan and his world order. So it's not just a person, just one person. It's Satan's world order. And so if you remember, well, I don't know if you've read it before, but if you've read it before or listened through it, in chapter 17, you've got this harlot, this lady harlot, who's sitting atop this scarlet beast, which is the fiery red dragon. and she's depicted as some kind of a religious system that's controlling the world order. And this is all under Satan. Satan controls all of this. And so that there it's 10 heads and 7, eventually 7, and then 7 crowns. And we'll get to that in a second. But so I believe this fiery red dragon, as it's described here, is not just Satan, but it's Satan and his world order. It's the whole world order that Satan controls. And so again, remember, it's not a literal woman. It's not a literal dragon. And we'll get back to whether the child is a literal child or not. But the dragon is not a literal dragon. It is Satan's world order run by Satan. So Satan's world order under Satan. Now, how is this fiery red dragon described here in verse 3? 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his heads. Now, this is symbolic also of the future in the tribulation period. There will be a time in which there are actually 10 kingdoms, and there are 10 kings in those kingdoms, but then eventually the Antichrist supplants 3 of those kingdoms, and he becomes the king in place of those. So there's 7 plus the Antichrist, who is actually ruling over the 7. And so you've got the 7 heads, the 10 horns, which horns are usually talking about kingdoms. And originally there were 10 kingdoms, and then the Antichrist gets rid of 3. We find this out from Daniel. We don't have time to go back and do a whole lot of cross-referencing, but if you want to go back and read the book of Daniel, especially chapter 9, even chapter 7, just read the whole book of Daniel, but especially those 2 chapters, then you'll see this picture as well. There are 10 kingdoms and 10 kings to those 10 kingdoms. Then the Antichrist replaces 3 of those, and so there's 7 plus the Antichrist, who's ruling over all of them. And so you've got the 7 heads, the 10 horns, and the 7 diadems on his heads, representing again those 10 kingdoms that with 10 kings that become 7 kings and 7 ruling authorities. And so this is, again, the fiery red dragon is not just Satan, but it is the world system, the physical, political world system that Satan controls. And so we see here the fiery red dragon, and he is where? Let's go ahead and look. Well, actually, let's see what he does first. Chapter 12, verse 4. What does he do first? What's he described as doing? Takes a third of the stars of heaven and throws them to earth. Now, what does that depict? Like literal stars or figurative stars? Figurative. Okay, what is it figurative of?
Population.
But they're in heaven. They're
Angels.
Angels. And so this spot and a couple other spots is where we get the idea that when Satan rebelled, he took a third of the angels of heaven with him. So if they're, you could put numbers on it, they only have a third, whereas we've got the other 2/3. So we've got more angels than they have demons, so we're good to go. No, even if we didn't, we still got the power of God in us. But so this is where we get that idea of a third of the stars, a third of the angels going with Satan in his rebellion. And I think that that's what this is speaking of. Now, this isn't happening right here, right now, in the present tribulation period. Again, this is looking back at history and seeing the fuller history of these things. And that's where he started out. That's where Satan started out. He started out by rebelling against God and then convincing a third of the angels, or deceiving a third of the angels, to come down with him and become demons, to leave God. And that's when he, grew a tail and got his pitchfork and became all red. No, I'm just kidding. No, he still looks like an angel of light, right? He is an angel of light. It's just evil angels are called demons, but they're of the same nature. They look exactly the same. So if Satan appeared to you, he would look just like a very angelic, beautiful being, just as the rest of these angels do. They look probably very beautiful, and they could probably deceive someone easily if they appeared in their angelic appearance. And so he took a third of the stars of heaven, threw them to earth, and that's where we get, again, the idea of the demons coming down and ruling with Satan over this earth during the previous time before Christ's return. Okay, now where's the dragon at? He's standing before who? So he's like the midwife, the evil midwife. He's like, okay, just one more push, Okay, breathe. Okay, now push, It's like, okay, demonic midwife there. Okay, so he's standing before the woman, and what does he want to do? He wants to eat the child. I'm so hungry I could eat a child. Okay, so again, the woman is Israel. The dragon is this world system that is headed by Satan. Okay, so you've got Israel, world system headed by Satan, and she's giving birth to a child who is, okay, well, let's get to the next part and decide who the child is. Okay, and so now we've seen the sign of the great red dragon, which is bringing it up to, it's kind of hard yet to decide. So we got to get to the next part, and then we can decide what this all is picturing. Yes?
I have a question, because just looking at this picture, it seems to me that if Satan's a ruler and he wants to eat the child, like that's kind of a practice that Satanists do, isn't it? Like the, I forgot their names, the god Molech or something, and they do that, right? They like.
Yeah, well, not literally, but yeah, child sacrifice is a thing where they often felt like the gods, the false gods, would want to eat the children, but obviously not not literally, figuratively, but literally they'd burn their kids. Figuratively, the demons would eat it. So, Satan practice is very disgusting and gross. But so we have to decide, is this literal? Like, is this literal childbirth? What do you guys think? Is this literal childbirth? Because it can't be literal childbirth because the woman is a figurative woman. So it's got to be figurative childbirth, and therefore the son is also figurative, right? So let's look at the birth of the child and the escape of the woman. Well, birth and escape of the child, and then also the escape of the woman. So looking at verse 5, it says, she bore a male child. Now, before we get any further, because we have to decide who's the identity of this child. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this, but there's some interesting things with the original language. So in the original language, you've got 3 grammatical genders. In English, there's only 2 grammatical genders, right? 2 genders in reality also, but grammatical genders, there's only 2, male and female, right? Or masculine and feminine genders in the grammatical genders. In Greek, you also have neuter gender, and that's oftentimes referred to things like rocks or stones or other things like that. It can also be used to refer to groups or other things like that. It just depends on the usage in the grammatical gender, for the grammatical gender usage. Here, the word male, it's the word male, it's talking about men, and yet it's used in the neuter gender. Now, there is a masculine gender form, but here it's used with the neuter grammatical gender for male. But you'd say, well, that's still talking about a guy. Why would it use neuter gender markers when it's talking about a male? And then child itself is the Greek word for son. So why would you need to say male son? I mean, obvious, ba? Of course it's a male, it's a son, right? You wouldn't say a female son because there's no such thing, It's a boy, it's obviously a boy. So why would you say male son? Now, there's a lot of biblical scholars that have an idea, and I agree with them. If you go back to the Old Testament, if you go back to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 7, it has a very similar picture. You can look that up sometime. It has a very similar picture where Israel is represented as a woman who's giving birth to her future descendants. And the future descendants are described as being a male child. And so the male child is not referring in that passage, in the Greek in that passage, it's the same exact wording, the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translation into Greek, the Septuagint. It has the same exact phrase here, male child. And that's referring to not just one, but a whole group of people. And so could it be in this passage that John, knowing the Septuagint, uses that same picture and says the male child, well actually it's, God really giving the vision, and says this is a male child, referring to not just one person, but to a group of people, which fits with the overall vision that's all symbolic. The woman is symbolic, the dragon is symbolic. It makes sense that the child is also symbolic. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. That's used, that very verbiage, that exact verbiage is used symbolically to speak of a group of people, not just one person, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Let's continue looking at the facts of verse 5. What does it say about this child? What is he to do? Rule all nations with a rod of iron. Now, instantly you say, well, that's got to be Jesus, right? Is that Jesus? Now, do you guys know where that comes from in the Old Testament? That's a prophecy from the Old Testament about Jesus. What's that? It's a prophecy from the Old Testament about Jesus. Do you guys know where that's from? What psalm that's from? Come on, my Bible college students. Come on, my graduates. Psalm 2 is where that's from. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. And it's referring to the millennial reign of Christ. So, well, but wait a second. That's got to be talking about Jesus then, right? Let's go back to Revelation chapter 2. To the church of Thyatira. Starting in verse 18, well, really, we don't have to read that whole portion. Just the promise. In verse 24, it says, now to you I say, and to the rest of Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden, but hold fast what you have till I come, and he overcomes and keeps my word till the end. To him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessel. There's something amazing about becoming a Christian. One of those amazing aspects is that we are united with Christ. We are called co-heirs with Christ in the New Testament. And that's part of that is that we will reign with Christ over the nations. So as Christ is to rule them with a rod of iron, we will be with him. Now as the church, what are we called with relation to Christ? We are called the what of Christ? We are called what? The body. The body of Christ. Can the body exist without the head? He's the head of the body. We wouldn't exist without Christ. We're united with Christ. We're part of him. If we don't have Christ, we're nothing. We don't exist. And so here, going back to Revelation chapter 12, verse 5, is this speaking about Jesus? Or is this speaking about the church that is his body, maybe even including Jesus, ruling over the nations? Remember, the dragon is not just Satan. The dragon is Satan ruling over a world political system. And so in the figurative language, it actually works better. Israel, then you've got the world system under Satan, and now you've got the church under Christ. At least that's what it seems to be. Look at the second thing. It says, rule them with a rod of iron. Then it says, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Now, this is obviously figurative, but it's picturing real history, or at least a summary of world history. We've got the woman with the moon and the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars, which represents Isaac, Rebekah, and the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 tribes of Jacob. That's history, at least a summary of history. Then you've got Satan and his workings on the earth. He took the stars down, and generally he's been causing mayhem and havoc and waiting for this child to be born because he wants to devour this child. So what snippet of history does this speak of? Well, let's take, for example, let's say, if this is talking about Jesus, what could this possibly represent? Well, I mean, if it's talking just about Jesus. If it's just talking to take the opposite perspective. Yeah. So some people would say it talks about the ascension. But does that really work with the ascension? Look at the text. When you think about the picture, Satan's waiting to gobble up Jesus. Some people say it's the ascension. But was Jesus ascending back to heaven to escape Satan and his world order? He'd already conquered them. He'd been killed, willingly. He allowed himself to be sacrificed on the cross by the Romans. It's not like he escaped anything. He already died. Now, maybe some people could say, maybe it's Jesus escaping Herod, when Herod sent down the soldiers to kill the babies at Bethlehem. But that was Jesus escaping to Egypt, not to heaven. So it doesn't work there either. It's not escaping to the throne of God. It's a different picture altogether. It doesn't work. Now, what about with the church? What does the Bible say about the future of the church? We will be caught up. And specifically, that is to escape. And yes, people accuse me of being an escapist. Yes, I'm an escapist. I don't want to experience the wrath of God. True. Guilty as charged. I don't want to experience the wrath of God on earth, which is the tribulation period. And during that tribulation period, you have the kingdoms under Satan, the world political order under Satan, that are trying to, that would have loved to destroy the church. But before they can have a chance, before Satan can have a chance, boom, caught up to heaven. And this word here, caught up, is the Greek word harpazo, which is the where we get the Latin version of it is rapture. That's where we get the English word rapture. This is the word for rapture right here, caught up. It makes sense in the broader picture that this is actually talking about the church. Of course, our head is Christ. And so therefore, all these things can relate to us, the ruling over the nations, all these things. But it makes sense if this is actually speaking about the church. The purpose of Israel was, of course, to bring forth Christ, but Christ's only purpose on the earth was to bring forth the church, to save us and then bring forth the church. And so I think this is talking specifically about the church, that when they are threatened by Satan and his world order, the world order of Satan, that they will be raptured up to heaven and taken out of that dangerous situation. And so I think this is really speaking about the pre-tribulational rapture of the church. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And so it's, I know these prophecies are a little bit confusing, but I think it's very, very clear. Not only that, but consider this. The word for child there in the final part of verse 5 is in the neuter, not in the masculine. In the previous portion, when it says male child, child there is in the masculine, but the male is in the neuter. Here it just uses the word child, and that's in the neuter. If it was referring to Jesus, it would definitely be in the masculine, but it's not. It's in the neuter, which means it's referring to a group and not to an individual. And so I really think this is definitely talking about the rapture of the church, which is one of the strong stances of Calvary Chapel. There are a lot of crazy things coming upon this earth. And sometimes it's uncertain, what's going to happen. I know there's a lot of crazy international things happening right now, but the world will not end. and Satan's world order will not be able to fully come forth and attack us before we are raptured up to his presence to be with him. Of course, it can still be bad, even though Satan's world order is not here. There's natural disasters, Myanmar, there's governments that want to kill Christians, North Korea, Iran. There's terrible things all the time, but it won't get to be the worst before God comes back and gets us. He's going to rescue us out of the clutches of Satan's world order. We will not be taken by Satan's world order. Now, what happens to the woman in verse 6? So the woman again represents Israel. So what happens to the woman? Why isn't she caught up too? Just the child. Think about that. When the rapture happens, we're caught up to heaven. The church is caught up to heaven. What about Israel? Why aren't they caught up to heaven? Aren't they the people of God? Is that true to call them the people of God? Romans chapter 11, the final part of chapter 11, says that the way that we should think about Israel is that they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. The promise is given to the fathers, but they're enemies for the sake of the gospel. At least we don't treat them as enemies, but they treat us as enemies because they don't believe that Jesus really is the Messiah. And so they've not accepted Christ. Anyone who's not accepted Christ won't go in the rapture. Only those who have accepted Christ will go in the rapture. And so Israel does not join. She must face her fate on this earth, although we know that God is going to preserve her, as we see here in verse 6. Let's look at verse 6. It says, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God." Now, this is not giving the full history of everything. But we know that, especially in the second half of the Great Tribulation, the first half, it'll be hunky-dory. They'll think that the Antichrist is actually the Messiah. Then in the second half of the tribulation, he'll go into the temple, he'll proclaim himself as God, and they'll be like, that's not our guy. He's doing things that are blasphemous, not just because he declares himself God, but because really the way he's doing all these things are blasphemous. Of course, he's not God, so him declaring himself as God is blasphemous. And so she flees into the wilderness, or driven into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God. Again, we've talked about that previously. Some people think it's the rock city of Petra. Maybe it's some other unknown location. Maybe God's kept it a secret all this time so that he could bring his people there, so that they won't be destroyed. That way they can be saved at the end. And how long are they going to be out there? So over 3.5 years. It's maybe just shy of the full 2 years. I don't know exactly how that works. Some of these things are kind of a mystery. Say, because we looked at Daniel before, the full is 1,290 days. This is 1,260 days. So maybe it takes them a little while to get out there. I don't know. Maybe it takes them 30 days to get out to the wilderness, and then they're going to be out there for the rest of that period. Or maybe the period in between the transition of the 2 years is a little bit much. It's like a month or so that they're then fleeing out to the wilderness. I don't know exactly how it works, but they're there for the second half of the Great Tribulation period. Because of course, God is not done with Israel. God is not going to completely cast them off. He is going to redeem them again because he has promised he would. Not because they deserve it, not like any of us deserve it, but because he promised he would. And so God will save them again. At least all who remain to the end will be saved. When Jesus comes back, they see Jesus. They have the Holy Spirit poured out. They'll believe in Jesus and receive the Holy Spirit as they see Jesus, the one whom they pierced. So God is not done with the nation of Israel. So here, I think there's a couple things that we can take to heart. Number one, as we look at past history and future history, we recognize that God is going to save us when it gets really crazy. When Satan's government comes upon this earth, God will save us from that. He will rapture us out of this world before Satan's government can attack us and destroy us. Because that's what Satan has always wanted to do, to attack us and destroy us. We will be caught up to heaven to be with the Lord during the tribulation period. Secondly, God's not done with Israel. He's going to preserve them until he can save them. And so 2 important things that we should remember as we continue on in this world, and especially in times of political upheaval and international upheaval, we can know that it's not going to get too bad before God comes back. It'll get bad, but it won't be crazy, crazy bad where you're just being, taken off by a satanic government and slaughtered, en masse, at least not all around the world. So God's going to come and get us. So let's not be afraid. Let's keep doing what God has called us to do and hold fast until he gets us. Amen?
Question?
Yes.